The candles in the entrance hall of Ashmore Park had not been lit to their full number in 5 years. Edmund noticed this the moment he slipped through the side passage beside the kitchen corridor, the one that led out beneath the stair landing, the one he had used as a boy when he wished to avoid his tutor. The marble floor was the same. The long oak banister was the same. The portrait of his father at the first turning, in the brown coat and the expression that managed simultaneously to be stern and quietly amused, was the same. Edmund stood beneath it for 4 seconds. He counted them, because 4 seconds was longer than he had permitted himself on any other night, and 4 seconds was already more than was wise. He heard the footman's step in the east corridor. He moved back into the passage before the man appeared, drew the panel shut behind him, and stood in the dark with his hands against the cold plaster, breathing. He was the stable master at Ashmore Park. He had been the stable master for 11 weeks. He was very good at it. He did not allow himself another 4 seconds. He went back to the stable block the way he had come, through the kitchen garden, past the dormant herb beds where his mother had grown lavender, past the gate that still hung slightly off its lower hinge, and he returned to the place where he slept, which was a room above the tack room, and which smelled of horse and leather and the iron cold of an autumn that had come early to Lincolnshire. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling, and did not sleep for some time. Ashmore Park had passed to Reginald Vane Ashmore upon the death notice of Edmund Charles Vane, rightful Earl of Ashmore, in the spring of 1809. The death notice had been produced by a solicitor named Glanville, who had acted as Edmund's guardian since the death of his parents, and who had, in the years between Edmund's 22nd and 27th birthdays, been systematically transferring the estate's assets into his own accounts, assisted by Reginald, who had been patient and calculating, and very good at waiting. Edmund had been 27 when Glanville's men had met him on the road to London, drugged his wine at an inn in Grantham, and put him unconscious on a merchant ship bound for Barbados. He had woken 3 days out to sea. It had taken him 5 years to come home. He had come back as a stable master because he needed the ledgers, and because no one would allow a stranger to touch the account books of a great estate without arousing suspicion. But a stable master was in and out of the house on legitimate business a dozen times a week, and a stable master could cultivate the trust of a housekeeper over the course of months, and a stable master, if he was patient, could eventually be permitted to carry documents between the steward's office and the study while the steward was at dinner. He had not anticipated Cecily. He had not anticipated her in the way one does not anticipate a thing one has not had reason to imagine. She was a governess at Ashmore. She had been a governess at Ashmore for 3 years, since Reginald had installed his widowed sister's children in the house, and found himself in need of someone respectable enough to educate them without costing him the annual wage of someone genuinely respectable. She was Miss Cecily Morrow, daughter of the late land agent, who had served the Vane family for 30 years before his own death left his daughter without provision or position. Reginald tolerated her because she cost very little, and the children had attached themselves to her in the tenacious way of children who have recently lost a parent, and dislodging her would have produced a scene he could not be bothered to manage. Cecily had not known the old Earl well. She had been 12 when Edmund's parents died, and Edmund himself had gone to London with Glanville. She had a memory of a tall boy on a gray horse, looking at something in the middle distance with the same expression his father wore in portraits. She did not connect that memory to the stable master until much later. She would be the first to admit that she had not been looking for it. What she did know was Ashmore itself. She had grown up at the edge of the estate, in the land agent's cottage near the south gate, and had understood the grounds the way a child understands a large, familiar thing, which is to say, not through its history or its value, but through its particular details. The way the kitchen garden smelled in August, The sound the west wing made in high wind. The drawer in the library that stuck unless you lifted the handle at the correct angle. When her father died, and she returned to Ashmore as a governess, she had found the estate altered in ways that were difficult to name precisely, but were immediately visible to anyone who had known it before. The home farm hedgerows were not maintained as they had been. The tenant cottages at the south boundary had a look of patient endurance rather than comfortable use. The library, which the old earl had kept in the obsessive order of a man who understood that a house was the sum of its particulars, had been allowed to accumulate the faint neglect of someone to whom books were furniture rather than companions. Reginald was not cruel to the house, exactly. He simply did not see it the way it needed to be seen, and the house knew, the way houses know, and was going slowly the color of something waiting. She came to the stable on the second Tuesday of October with the children, Thomas aged 8 and Agnes aged 6, who wished to see the grey mare that had arrived the previous week from Nottingham. Edmund was at the mounting block with a gelding when they appeared at the yard gate, and Agnes ran ahead the way she always did, and Thomas followed with the dignity appropriate to his age and sex, and Cecily walked behind them both with her hands clasped at her waist, and her plain dark gown doing nothing at all against the morning cold. Edmund watched them for a moment from his position near the mounting block. He noticed that her gloves had been mended at the right forefinger. He noticed that she did not slow her pace to match the cold, but moved through it as though she had long since stopped expecting the world to arrange itself for her comfort. He noticed these things, and then looked at the gelding, because noticing was not something he had the luxury of indulging just now. The grey mare was in the third stall. Agnes pressed her face between the boards and reached through to touch the velvet nose that obligingly lowered itself, and Thomas stood at a more measured distance and asked questions about breeding and bloodlines in the tone of a boy who has decided to be interested in horses because it is the correct thing for a young gentleman. Edmund answered him. Cecily stood at the edge of the scene and watched both children with a steady attention that missed nothing. She had a way of watching the children that made him think of the way his old steward had surveyed the home farm at the end of each summer, not with anxiety, but with knowledge, accounting for things, ensuring that what should be well was well. At some point Thomas asked a question Edmund could not quite hear, and Cecily answered it, and Edmund glanced up, and she was already looking at him, and looked away first. That was the second Tuesday of October. On the third Tuesday, she came back without the children. She said she had a note to deliver to the head groom about the carriage horses for the following week, and she handed it over, and was turning to leave when the grey mare put her nose over the stall door, and she stopped and put her hand up to the velvet muzzle without thinking about it first. Edmund was behind her at the tack bench, oiling a set of reins that did not urgently require oiling. He was aware of this fact about himself without pleasure. "She is settling," Cecily said, of the mare. "She is," he said. "She was mishandled somewhere before Nottingham. You can see it in the way she startles at sudden sounds from the left side." She was looking at the mare as she said this, her hand moving in a slow stroke along the grey jaw. Someone was right-handed and impatient. He had noticed the same thing, the first week. He said so. She looked at him over her shoulder, the way people look when they have said something they expected to go unremarked, and found instead that it had been understood. He did not look away quickly enough. She looked back at the mare. "My father said the Vane stables were the best kept in 3 counties, she said, "under the old management." "I have read something similar," he said, which was not precisely a lie. She was quiet for a moment. The mare breathed against her palm. He went on oiling the reins. "You are making progress," she said, which meant something, and she left the stable, and he sat with the reins in his hands for some time after. On the 4th Tuesday of October, Edmund was crossing the yard between the carriage house and the tack room when he heard Reginald's voice in the passage beside the steward's office. Reginald had not been at Ashmore for 3 weeks. He had come back from London in a poor temper with 2 trunks, a new valet, and Miss Adeline Pemberton, who had arrived in a separate carriage with her mother and a quantity of luggage that suggested an extended stay. The Pemberton family had money from trade, a great deal of it, and Miss Pemberton was their careful investment in social position. Reginald needed the match because Ashmore was mortgaged to very nearly its limit, and the Pemberton settlement would clear the debt. Edmund knew the number to the penny because he had spent 11 weeks finding it in the ledgers. Reginald was speaking to his steward, Holt, about the winter arrangements for the south pasture. Edmund slowed his pace and listened without appearing to do so. "And the governess," Reginald said, his voice carrying the slight impatience it always carried when he spoke about something he considered beneath his attention. "She is to remain in the schoolroom wing through the holiday. The children need not be seen below stairs, while Miss Pemberton is in residence." Holt said something low. "She is the governess, and nothing more," Reginald said, as though correcting an error of category. "She has no claim on the drawing room. See to it." Edmund turned in at the tack room door and stood for a moment in the smell of leather and the particular quality of autumn light that came through the one small window. He thought about what it meant that a man who had taken someone else's house could dismiss someone else's dependent, as though the dismissal were his to make. He thought about this for rather longer than he had thought about the portrait of his father. And then he went back to work. If you have ever watched a person make themselves small in a room where they were not wanted, you will understand something of what the next weeks at Ashmore required of Cecily. She was not timid. This is the first thing to understand about her. She was not timid, and she was not afraid of Reginald Vane Ashmore. But she had been in dependent positions long enough to understand the economy of self-erasure, the way one learns to take up precisely as much air as is one's due, and not a breath more, and she had perfected this economy in the 3 years since her father's death had left her without any better option. The children needed her. While they needed her, she had a place. She did not look much further ahead than that. What she had not learned to make small was her judgment. This would eventually cost her something. It cost her in early November, on an afternoon when the frost had come in hard overnight, and the yard was still rimed along the boards of the fencing. She was returning from the library with the children when she heard a voice from the stable yard, raised and impatient, and beneath it the sound of a horse in distress. She handed Thomas the books and told him to take his sister inside. Then she went to the yard gate. One of Reginald's London friends, a man named Cheshire, was standing in the yard with a crop in his hand. The gray mare was backed against the far fence, ears flat, eyes showing white. Cheshire had apparently decided that the mare required correction for some offense that the mare could not have understood, and he was delivering this correction with the enthusiasm of a man who had never considered that the animal's fear might be information rather than insubordination. "Stop," Cecily said. The word came out of her at a level and carrying volume that surprised even herself. Cheshire turned. Edmund, who had heard it from the tack-room door, went still. "Beg your pardon," Cheshire said, in the tone of a man who has never been told to stop by anyone he considers it worth his while to listen to. "You will hurt her," Cecily said. She was already crossing the yard toward the mare, keeping her voice below the level of confrontation, because the mare needed quiet, not escalation. "She is not misbehaving. She is frightened. There is a difference, and if you cannot tell it, you should not be in this yard." Cheshire looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Edmund, who had come out of the tack room and was standing at the edge of the scene with his arms at his sides and an expression that was entirely composed and entirely watchful. "Who is this woman?" Cheshire said to Edmund. "The governess," Edmund said, his voice level. "And you allow the governess to speak to guests in this fashion?" "The governess," Edmund said, "is right about the mayor." The silence that followed was the kind that decides something. Cheshire looked between them, found neither face giving him anything useful, and departed with the crop under his arm. And the injured dignity of a man who has been outweighed in argument, and cannot say precisely when it happened. Edmund crossed to the mare and put his hand against the damp curve of her neck. Cecily was already there, murmuring something he could not quite hear, her hand steadying and certain on the animal's jaw. After a moment, Cecily looked up at him. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, or from something else. Her expression was not gratitude, and it was not quite surprise. It was the expression of a person who has been expecting the floor to give way for a long time and has just put their foot down on a plank that held. "Thank you," she said. "You did not require the assistance," he said. She looked at him again, and then at the ring of cord visible for a moment at his collar, where his coat had pulled open in the cold. And then she looked away. Edmund straightened his coat. He went back to the tack room. He stood inside with the door not quite closed, and understood something he had been managing not to understand for several weeks. Lady Honoria Vane had lived in the Dower cottage since the death of her brother, Edmund's father, 12 years ago. She was 71 years old and had the upright posture of a woman who had decided decades earlier that the world would not see her bend, and had kept this decision without effort or ostentation ever since. She had known from the first week Edmund had been at Ashmore as the stable master that he was Edmund. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and Honoria had been looking at both faces since long before Edmund was born. She had said nothing because Edmund, on the second day, had managed a moment alone with her in the kitchen garden and had pressed her hand and said quietly, "Not yet, Aunt. I need the ledgers first." She had looked at him for a long time and then inclined her head once, the way she had always agreed to things she found deeply irregular, but would not refuse. She came to the stable yard that afternoon, as she sometimes did, to inquire about the health of the horses that pulled her small carriage. Edmund was alone when she arrived. She looked at him for a moment in the particular silence that had always existed between them. The silence of two people who are holding the same knowledge in different vessels. "She knew your father," Honoria said without preamble. Edmund did not ask who. "She was 12, I think. She said once that she remembered a boy on a gray horse." Honoria turned to look at the mare in the third stall. "I have not told her anything. I want you to know that I have not told her anything." Edmund said, "I know, Aunt." "She is a good woman," Honoria said. "That is my only contribution to this conversation." She went back to the Dower cottage. Edmund stood for a moment in the dimming afternoon light, and it was not the mare he was looking at. The last evening of November was cold enough that the stable's water troughs had a skim of ice on them at 4 in the afternoon, and Edmund had been breaking it back since 3. Cecily came to the stable without the children that evening. She stood at the door for a moment, and he could see from the set of her shoulders that she had come to ask something and had been arguing herself out of it. "You have been here 11 weeks, she said. He said, "I have. And you are not what you appear." She said it without an accusation in it. It was the observation of a careful woman who has been paying attention to a puzzle and has reached the point where not naming it aloud is no longer neutral. He was silent long enough that the silence was itself an answer, though not a complete one. "You are not going to tell me," she said. "Not yet," he said. She looked at the cord at his throat for a moment, the one she had glimpsed in the yard that afternoon with the mare. He did not move to conceal it. "My father served the Vane family for 30 years, she said. He spoke of the old Earl, as though he were the last man in England who knew the proper order of things. He did not say the same of the cousin." She paused. "I found the ledgers 2 months ago, the ones from the year before the death notice. I have been reading them." He looked at her then. Fully. "I have not told anyone," she said. "I did not know what I was reading until I came across the transfer documents. I know what I am reading now." The stable was very quiet. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to come down, visible through the open upper door, soft and methodical in the darkening air. He put his hand to the cord at his throat and drew out what hung from it. His father's signet ring, the seal of the Earls of Ashmore, warm from being worn against his skin. He held it in his palm for a moment. Then he closed his fist around it. "The night Glanville sent men to meet me on the Grantham Road," he said quietly, "I believed he was keeping the estate for my return. I believed the arrangement he had described to me was in my interests. I was 27 years old, and I had trusted him since I was 15. He stopped. He turned the ring against his palm, though she could not see it. "By the time I understood what had happened, I was in Barbados. By the time I had money enough to come home, 5 years had passed, and a death certificate bore my name." She did not speak. She was the kind of listener who knew that the purpose of silence was to let the thing being said arrive whole rather than interrupted. "I need the ledgers," he said, "and I need Glanville's correspondence with Reginald, which I believe is in the study, and I need a justice of the peace who can be reached in Stamford, which I have arranged." He looked at her. "I have almost everything I need." She met his eyes. "The ledgers are in the library cellar," she said. "I can show you precisely where." He had known for some time that she was unlike most people he had encountered in his life, but this was the moment when he understood the specific way in which she was unlike them, and he did not look away from her face quickly enough to hide it. You may not know, if you have never waited for something for 5 years while learning to want nothing, how strange it is to find that wanting has not in fact been extinguished in you, only banked, and that one person standing in a cold stable in November, with calm eyes and mended gloves, is apparently sufficient to let it speak again. Edmund folded it back down, the way he had learned to fold down everything that could not be used just now. He put the ring back under his shirt. "If you are still with this story, you already know what is coming. Stay with it a moment longer." In late November, Reginald arranged a small supper for the Pemberton family and 3 of the neighboring households he considered worth impressing. Cecily had no reason to attend, but Thomas had a cough that required her to pass through the ante-room off the dining room twice that evening to fetch a remedy from the housekeeper. She was crossing the passage the second time, candle in hand, when she heard Lady Pemberton's voice through the half-open door. "And who is that, precisely?" Lady Pemberton said, in the voice of a woman asking a question whose answer she already considers beneath her. Reginald said something she could not hear. "Ah," Lady Pemberton said. "Merely a governess. One of those educated paupers the old families are compelled to keep about. I find them rather sad, on the whole. All that polish and so little prospect." There was a murmur of polite agreement from the table, and the sound of a glass being set down. Cecily stood in the passage with her candle and looked at the particular quality of the dark beyond it. She was not embarrassed. She had been called worse by people whose opinion carried more weight. She was, however, aware that the sound of those words settling into the room had a quality she recognized from long experience, the quality of a thing accepted as obvious by everyone present, and that she had no standing to dispute it from where she stood. She went back upstairs to Thomas with the remedy. She sat beside him until his breathing eased and did not think about it further, except in the way that one does not think about something that has taken up a permanent position just below the surface of thought. Reginald found the cellar on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of December, when Holt informed him that Miss Morrow had been seen by one of the kitchen maids descending to the library cellar with a candle and a ledger book tucked under her arm. Reginald was not a man who had survived 5 years of running an estate he did not own without developing a particular sensitivity to the sound of something approaching its end. He came to the library himself. He opened the cellar door. He found the ledgers precisely as Cecily had left them, open at the transfer pages, with a folded piece of paper that bore Edmund's handwriting laid carefully between them. She had not concealed this. She had not expected discovery, but she had not hidden what she was doing, which told him something about her that he would think about later. He sent for her. The dining room was still laid from luncheon when she arrived. Reginald was standing at the window. The Pembertons, who had extended their stay at Ashmore on the optimistic supposition that an engagement announcement was imminent, were visible through the glass in the garden, Miss Adeline in blue wool, her arm through her mother's, looking at the parterre beds with the expression of a woman measuring what she is about to acquire. "You have been in the cellar," Reginald said. "I have," she said. "You have been taking documents that do not belong to you." "I have been reading documents that belong to the estate," she said, "which is not precisely the same thing." He turned from the window. His expression had the particular flatness of a man who has made a calculation and arrived at a number he does not like. "You will be gone by morning," he said. "You will take whatever belongs to you personally, and leave what belongs to the house. The children's education can be managed without you." She did not speak immediately. She stood with her hands at her sides, and something moved across her face that she did not suppress, which was not fear exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. The specific apprehension of a woman who has known for a long time that her position was conditional, and has just been shown the condition. "She is the governess and nothing more," Reginald said to Holt, who had come to stand in the doorway. "As is the stable master. They are hired staff. Neither of them has any standing here." He had not heard Edmund on the stair landing. Edmund had come in from the yard to deliver the letter to the steward's office, the one he needed Holt to carry to Stamford by morning, and he had heard Reginald's voice in the dining room and had stopped on the landing above. He heard what was said. He stood very still. He heard Cecily say, in a voice that was entirely steady, "I see. Then I will say good evening, Mr. Vane Ashmore." He heard her steps on the passage floor, moving toward the back stairs. He heard her pause for a moment, and he knew, though he could not see her face, that she had paused because she was making the kind of decision that only presents itself in the few seconds before a door closes behind you. She said quietly, to no one in particular, and to him, though she did not know he was there, "He gave me 3 years of work, and a place to keep the children safe. That is what I would say if anyone asked me what it meant to serve a house well." The door opened. Her steps went up the back stair. Edmund stood on the landing with his hand on the banister and understood that almost was no longer sufficient. That night, he heard her moving in the room above the back passage, the governess's room with the single narrow window that faced the kitchen garden. He heard the sound of a trunk being opened and the particular silence that follows it, which is the silence of a person taking stock of everything they possess and understanding that it will fit easily into a single container and that this is not a relief, but a verdict. He lay on his back above the tack room and listened to the estate settle into its nightly quiet, the creak of joists, the wind at the eaves. the one loose shutter on the east face of the stable that he had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. He thought about the ledgers in the cellar, and about Glanville's letters in the study drawer, and about the justice of the peace in Stamford, who had agreed to ride out in the morning if he received the word by 9. He thought about the fact that the justice might not arrive before the post-coach, and that the post-coach left at 7, and that 7 was before 9. He got up at 5 and wrote the letter himself and gave it to the justice's boy, who was waiting at the south gate as arranged, and told him to ride hard. He was not present at Reginald's dinner on the following evening. He was expected at the stable. He was, in fact, at the stable for the first part of the evening, long enough to ensure the horses were settled and the tack room was locked, and then he went to his room above it and opened the trunk that had been under the bed since the day he arrived, and removed the coat he had not worn since London. It was dark blue, superfine, with the cuffs a rational man would associate with a particular level of rank. He put it on. He put his father's ring on his right hand for the first time in 5 years. He went down to the yard and walked through the kitchen garden and through the kitchen corridor and up the main stair. And he did not pause at his father's portrait this time because he had something to do. The dinner was in the long room. 16 people sat at table. The Pembertons occupied the places of honor, and several of the local families had been invited along with 2 of Reginald's London friends, and Lady Honoria sat at the far end because Reginald could not quite manage to exclude her entirely, and Cecily sat below the salt because there was no post-coach from Grantham until morning, and she had nowhere to go at 10 at night. She had been seated at the bottom of the table, below the Pembertons' maidservant, who had been elevated for the evening, and she sat there with her hands folded and her expression the particular composure of a woman who has decided that if she is to be publicly diminished, she will be publicly dignified about it. Lady Pemberton had been holding court on the subject of Reginald's future governance of the estate for approximately 15 minutes when Edmund opened the door. He did not hurry. He walked the length of the room in the blue coat, in the way he had learned to walk before he was 25, and forgotten for 5 years, and it came back as though it had only been waiting. The 16 people at table turned in stages, the way people turn when they realize that the specific quality of someone's entrance requires attention. Reginald rose from his chair. "What in God's name?" he began. Beside him was a man in the plain coat of a country justice, who had ridden from Stamford in 3 hours. He carried in his coat pocket the first of Glanville's letters to Reginald, which Edmund had extracted from the study 6 days ago, a certified copy of the Ashmore entail, and a statement from a notary in Bridgetown, Barbados, attesting to the identity of the man known for 5 years in that colony as Edmund Ward, son of the late Earl of Ashmore, who bore on the small finger of his right hand the seal ring his father had given him on his 18th birthday. Edmund looked at Reginald. He did not raise his voice. "My name is Edmund Vane. This is my house." The room held this for a long moment. Lady Honoria was the first person to move. She set her wineglass down on the table with a small definitive sound and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her nephew across the candle-lit length of the room with an expression that was not triumph and was not surprise, and was very simply the relief of a woman who has held a thing too long and has finally been permitted to put it down. Reginald said something. Edmund did not particularly attend to what it was. Holt, who had come in behind Edmund with the express purpose of being useful, moved to close the door to the passage. The justice of the peace removed the papers from his coat. Miss Pemberton's mother made a small sound and said something to her daughter in a low voice that carried the particular inflection of a woman revising a plan. Reginald's voice rose. It was, in the end, not his best decision. He appealed to the room. which was the room he had assembled, and which turned out not to be assembled in his favor. The local families who had known the Vane estate for generations had a particular way of looking at the letters the justice now laid before them, the way one looks at a thing that explains a number of other things one had quietly found inexplicable. Sir Robert Halford, who had been the nearest neighbor to Ashmore for 40 years and had known Edmund's father, looked at the seal ring and looked at Edmund's face and said, "Good God," in a tone that required no elaboration. It was Sir Robert who turned to Reginald and said, in a voice that was quiet and carried the whole room, "You will leave this house tonight. I believe the situation is clear enough." He looked at the justice, who nodded. "I will witness whatever confirmation is required." Reginald understood then, in the way of a man who has known the floor was built on borrowed timber and has finally heard it give. He did not speak. He looked at Edmund once with something that might, in another life, have been shame. And then he walked out of the room with Holt beside him, and Miss Pemberton and her mother rose together with the synchronized efficiency of two women who have already decided to be elsewhere. And the room exhaled into the specific quiet that follows the collapse of a thing that has been wrong for a long time. Edmund looked down the table. Cecily was still in her chair at the far end. She had not moved during any of it. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes on his face, and the expression she wore was not the expression of a woman watching a stranger. It was the expression of a woman who has been reading a long and complicated letter and has finally arrived at the line that explains every previous one. Lady Honoria rose from her chair and went to stand near the fire, because there are moments that belong to other people, and she had always been good at knowing which ones. He walked the length of the table. He did not speak. He drew the cord from under his collar. The ring he had moved from his hand back to the cord after the justice confirmed the documents, because there was one thing remaining to do with it. He held it out to her in his open palm. She looked at the ring for a moment, and then at his face. "You knew the last time we spoke?" she said. "I had almost everything I needed," he said. "And then I did." She looked at the ring again. She did not take it from his hand, not yet. She said, "Thomas and Agnes." "We'll stay at Ashmore as long as they need a home," he said. She looked up at him with the kind of directness she had never once softened, because there had never been anyone worth the cost of softening it. "You are going to ask me something," she said. "I am going to ask you something," he said. She put her hand under his and closed her fingers around the ring and around his hand together, and she held both. The fire at the end of the room went on burning. Snow was moving past the long windows, soft and unhurried, laying itself over the park that had been his father's and was now his, over the stable yard where he had slept for 11 weeks, over the kitchen garden and the herb beds and the gate with the broken hinge, over all of it equally and without distinction. The months that followed brought a great many things in their order. Glanville's prosecution ran into the spring and ended in a conviction that satisfied the court without requiring any particular cruelty of anyone present. The repair of the south pasture fence was the first item on Edmund's list when he took inventory of what Reginald's tenure had cost the estate. The gradual return of the tenant's confidence took longer than any legal proceeding and was accomplished primarily by Edmund walking the home farm boundary at dawn every week with the new steward and paying attention to what was actually there. Lady Honoria resumed her place at the head of the dower cottage with the satisfying completeness of a person restored to exactly the position they should always have occupied. She took her meals at the main house on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which suited her. Thomas and Agnes remained at Ashmore, as had been promised. Thomas took to the stable with the earnest dedication of a boy who has decided on a thing and means to know it thoroughly. Agnes stopped being afraid of the grey mare in the third stall by February and began bringing her apple peel on Sunday mornings, which the mare accepted with a gravity that seemed appropriate to the occasion. On a Tuesday evening in late December, in the study that had been his father's, and was now his, Edmund sat with Cecily by the fire, with the account ledgers open between them, because she had been reading them for 2 months longer than he had, and understood the patterns in them better. And because this was, he had come to understand, precisely the kind of working company that suited them both. He reached across the ledger and took the cord from where it lay at the base of her throat, the ring warm on the end of it from being worn against her skin. He held it for a moment in his palm, looking at the seal. "My father would have known what to say about this evening," he said. "He would have approved of it," she said, without looking up from the ledger page. He looked at the side of her face and thought she was probably right. He closed his hand around the ring and was quiet for a moment, listening to the fire and to the wind off the park that came down the chimney in a low note, and to the snow that went on falling outside the window in the dark. He had been the stable master for 11 weeks, and an earl for 3. He thought, without irony and without sentiment, that the second position suited him rather better. If this story found you this evening, leave a word in the quiet below. Thank you for staying to the end.